Alrighty, good to go.
Good to go? All right. So I'm going to do my self-introduction. That's pretty cool. I'm Todd Jackson, and I've been beekeeping for 5 years now. I have 8 colonies. I have 6 of them in Chesapeake, and then I have 2 of them that are out in Windsor area out by Walters. So that's where 2 of my hives are. They're out on my brother's property. I started this 5 years ago, though actually this is going to be starting my 6th year. I was on the internet looking and came across an article about the demise of honeybee colonies and bees going away. And so I started researching more and found a 101 course locally and said, hey, this is kind of where I should be. So I went and took the course. I got done, and my wife knows kind of my OCD, obsessive compulsive thing, and she's like, oh my God, you took a 101 course. She goes, I need to learn about beekeeping too, because the train's about ready to pull out of the station, and she needs to get on board. So we looked up and found another 101 course, and we went to that. And then after that, my daughter says, oh my gosh, you guys are going to be beekeeping. We need to go. So we found a 3rd course, and the whole family went to a 3rd course. So prior to ever having bees, I went through 3 101 courses. And then one of the things that I learned in the process, I found a mentor. That is key to success and surrounding yourself by successful people. I actually know 5 master beekeepers. I pretty much have them on speed dial. I'm a journeyman beekeeper, kind of mid-level. But surrounding yourself with successful people, getting a good mentor, and prior to getting your bees, I would find somebody and go into their bees and learn and do a little bit of bee yard sweat equity and work with the bees. So my mentor was, or is still, is Andy Westrick. He's a master beekeeper. Before I ever had any bees at all, I had probably done 20 splits, probably about 30 hive inspections. I installed 8 nukes into the equipment. So basically I was going through the gamut of stuff, so I actually got a lot of experience prior to ever getting bees on hand. So again, surrounding yourself by successful people. A little bit about my past. I was in the Navy for 21 years. I retired from the Navy. I work for the Civil Service. I work for the Department of the Navy. I do inspections for the electronic repair program. So that's kind of my other side of that. I like to do a lot of tech when it comes to bee monitoring, temperatures and stuff like that. I'd like to thank the NASMO folks for inviting me to do this. I really like to share and help out new beekeepers and provide information. Any questions? I'm going to be going through the lecture. If you have any questions that aren't nagging, we can wait till the end and go through a question thing at the end. But if you do have something that's, really just, because sometimes I'm that way, is I forget that, I'm afraid I'm going to forget, but go ahead and ask questions. I'm not afraid of questions. But I'm going to be covering honeybee pests and diseases. This is kind of the doom and gloom topic of beekeeping. This is talking about all the unfun stuff that you may run across. And so with that, curious, not clicking.
And with that, the last student just pulled up into the parking lot.
Oh. We will wait.
It's okay, come on back. You're just getting ready to do the first slide.
Just about ready. So this is a little bit of respooling. I'm Todd Jackson, and I'm a Virginia State beekeeper, journeyman beekeeper. I'm actually a member of Colonial Beekeepers, Norfolk Beekeepers, and Tidewater Beekeepers Association. I'm going to be covering honeybee diseases and pests. So this is kind of a key thing. This is kind of thrown out there as a doom and gloom topic. This talks about all the stuff that can go on in the hive. So as a beekeeper, honeybee brood and adults are attacked by many things: bacteria, virus, protozoa, and parasitic mites. So as a beekeeper, you need to be vigilant. You need to be on this, and doing proper management of your bees will separate you from being a bee haver to being a beekeeper. So kind of going with a samurai on this is knowing your enemy is to know his sword. So I'm going to go over these different diseases, different pests, and different things that your bees are going to deal with. So to know the weapons that these different things are using against you, you'll know how to protect yourself from these different things that will be in the hive. So I'm going to start out with the top of the list of the number one bad thing that can happen, and that's American foul brood. American foul brood is a bacterial disease of the pupa, and this bacteria forms highly persistent spores and can be spread by adult bees and equipment. The infected larvae start out, they change from their pearly white color, they're healthy pearly white, and then they turn to a brown color, and they die after they are capped. So one of the key things here is healthy larva is pearly white. If it starts to change in color, there are issues here. So pearly white is what you should look for when you're doing a hive inspection. So pearly white. Also, the other thing in here is it can be transferred by equipment. I suggest that as you're starting out as a beekeeper, buy brand new equipment. If you're going to go buy it off Craigslist or someplace and Grandpa had it out there and who knows what happened in that equipment, buy fresh. It gives you a chance to build equipment, start out new, but again, American foul brood can be transferred by equipment. So what are we looking at? So when you're looking at your hive, you're doing a hive inspection, there's going to be a spotty brood pattern, and a lot of these diseases and stuff in there are just going to be a spotty brood pattern. The cappings are going to be sunken, they're going to be perforated and greasy in appearance, and the larvae are going to be brown and ropey, and it's going to have a foul, kind of disgusting smell. So the way to test for this is you're going to use the toothpick. You're going to thrust it into a cell and you're going to stir it around in the cell. And as you pull out that toothpick or stick out of that cell, it's going to be ropey. It's going to be sticky, and that is indicative of American foul brood, and it will rope out about an inch.
What would it normally be?
Normally you wouldn't see that because
You wouldn't see anything coming out of the cell?
it would be there would be a white pupa in there, pearly white pupa.
Okay.
Anything that's other than white is not good inside that cell.
Okay.
So, but in this one, you stick it in there, you're going to swirl it around, and it's going to be brown and ropey. It's going to be snotty, kind of stringy. So this is going to be, and going back, pearly white pupa larva is normal. Anything other than that color is going to be an alarm signal. So here is a frame of bees brood with American foul brood. You can see it's got grease. It's kind of a greasy appearance. It's spotty brood pattern. What you can see in there, it's brown. There's perforated cappings, and this is indicative of American foul brood. Again, this is kind of one of the worst things you can have in your hive, and it is spread easily from hive to hive because adult bees can spread it. When the hive dies off, there's honey products left behind. That colony gets robbed out, and it spreads it out to other colonies, and then it starts to become a big issue. So with that, my suggestion, if you suspect you have colonies have American foul brood, I'm just contact the state apiarist, Keith Digner. There's his information. There's his phone number. There's his email address, and also or your local inspector. Because if you really think you have it, they're going to show up. The state of Virginia VDAX folks are going to show up and go through a hive inspection to make sure you don't have American foul brood. Next on the list is European foul brood. Again, this is a bacterial disease of the larva, and they die before they are capped. So, American foul brood, they die after they're capped. The pupas turn brown and they die after they're capped. European foul brood, the larvae die before they are capped. The infected brood are creamy in color and they're twisted in the bottom of the cells. And as it progresses, they have a smooth, kind of melted appearance. Again, the European foul brood is not a persistent spore like American foul brood, so this is kind of not as a dangerous environment for your bees. And it usually clears up once the nectar flow, once spring sets in. If you have this, it will usually clear itself up. If not, requeening is another option to get out of this European foul brood. So as we look at it, spotty scattered brood pattern. Cappings are sunken, perforated, or discolored. The larvae are yellow, tan, or brown, but they are not ropey. So if you stick a stick in there, they're not going to rope out like American foul brood. And it has a sour smell. So it's not as an intense smell as the American foul brood. And here is a frame of larvae that have been affected by European foul brood. And if you can look in there and you can see it's spotty, the cappings are sunken, and you can see the actual, they're kind of a glassy, kind of shiny color. And that is the indicative of the European foul brood.
Can you show them the one with the scale? Because that's kind of how they end up towards the end.
You're talking down here?
Yeah, the ones where they're like in the bottom
They're
part
in the
of
bottom.
the
They're
cell.
kind of they dry up and they turn into kind of a scale in the bottom. Next is chalk brood. Chalk brood is a fungal disease of the larva, and the infected larvae turn kind of chalky. They get hard and then eventually turn black. Chalk brood is most frequent during the springtime when there's a lot of moisture out, and during the spring buildup, it will clear itself up usually as the air kind of gets less moisture in it, and the colony usually recovers on its own. Again, scattered spotty brood pattern. Cappings are sunk and perforated. The larvae are white and moldy and later turn black and hard. And there is no smell. This is a normal smell in the hive. And this is a frame that has chalk brood. And you can see the white, the pupa have turned white and chalk-like in here. And they're hard. And that is chalk brood. So next on the list is nosema. Nosema is a protozoan disease of honeybees and basically gives them basically dysentery. This gives the bees a digestive kind of problem. And it happens in damp, cold conditions. But again, good airflow around the hive should reduce the chances of nosema. And there's actually, for the master beekeeper portion, they actually do a test to test for nosema. You take 100 bees, you crush them up, you mix them with some water, and you actually look for that picture right there on the slide of the protozoan. These are the protozoan right here, these little round portions. And that is the only way you can actually truly test to see if your hive has nosema. There are indicators that you may have it, which this right here is the front of the hive. This is an indication that the bees have dysentery. This is bee poop for any other kind of, but this is on the front of the hive, and this is indicative of bees with dysentery. But again, the true indicator to find out whether you have nosema is actually do a test. The bee is going to appear weak. They're going to crawl around aimlessly. The bees affected have a reduced lifespan, and again, there's signs of dysentery on the hive, and that is nosema. Next on the list is tracheomites. These are kind of taken back to the back seat to the next thing I'm going to talk about. But tracheomites are very, very small microscopic mites, and they get into the trachea of the bees. They're actual breathing tubes, and they get in there and they feed on the trachea. They kind of block the airway. They suck the blood in the trachea, and basically the bees, they're going to show the same sign as nosema. They're going to be weak. They're going to be tired, and then sometimes they have discouple their wings. Normally bees, when they're in the hive, both the fore and aft wings will be over the top of each other. But when they discouple their wings, this is a sign that the bees are not doing well. So that is tracheomites. All right, here we go. On to my favorite of everything. Varroa destructor. So we're going to talk about varroa mites. I'm going to cover quite a bit on this because this is probably the bane of beekeepers' existence. This is a fine pest that was brought to us from China. As many things come from China that are awesome. So this is Varroa destructor. It showed up into the country in about the late 80s, and we've been dealing with it. One person that I talked to, he said that basically it's what we're doing is mite management with a little bit of beekeeping thrown in on the side. So I'm just going from there. My wife, she got tired of varroa mite conversations and stuff like that. Every time we go to bee, are we going to talk about varroa? Yeah, we're going to talk about varroa mites. So let's talk about varroa mites. They are mites. They're copper. They're about pinhead size. and the female mites cling to the adult bodies of the bees and suck their fatty bodies. Now, there's a mite here, mite up here, and this young bee here, and I look at this picture, and this is very important to look at. It kind of gives you a thought process. This is a nurse bee. This is a freshly emerged nurse bee. You're going to find these are what's called phoretic mites. These are the mites on the outside on the bees. In the varroa mites, about 15% of them are going to be on the bees. The other 85% of your mite population will be under the cappings. So this is something you need to kind of keep in mind. So this mite here is going to go into the cell, and they're going to feed on the pupa as it develops. So I'm going to go over kind of the process real quick here on how this happens. So the founder's mite, mom, is going to slide into the cell just before the nurse bees cap that cell. So the actual larva gives off a pheromone saying, hey, I'm old enough to be capped, I'm ready to go into pupation. So there is a pheromone release. Guess what? The mites can sense that pheromone too. So the mite slips into the cell, buries itself into the brood food, into the royal jelly, and kind of sticks up a little periscope out so it can breathe. It's got a breathing tube, so it hides in there. The nurse bees cap it over. The larva starts to go through pupation. It starts to eat that food, and it allows that mite that's in there to be freed up. The mite goes onto the pupa, bites the pupa, scars it, and opens up a feeding spot on that pupa. And then the next thing that happens in this process is she starts to reproduce. So the first one she reproduces it's a boy. She produces a male. After that, the next one will be a female. And every successful 30 hours after that, it will be a female offspring that she lays. Once the male matures fully, he will mate with his sisters. So, the reason I say this is because mites their breeding process makes it so if they survive different chemical treatments, they become more resistant because of the genetics are kind of in line. It's a brother and sister creating a offspring, or actually inbreeding so that the sister is capable of reproducing later and becoming a founder's mite. So with that, in worker cells, the capping time between workers and drones is different. So BMAP. Did you guys do BMAP last week? They did BMAP. All right. So, okay, let's respin this. BMAP. Workers. What day do they emerge from their cells? Day
12.
Inversely proportional. Day 21.
Oh.
Day 21. Drones. Day 24. 24. So there are 3 more days that the drones are under the capping. And I'm kind of going over this because it's kind of important to kind of understand this, especially later on in some other mite management protocols. Believe it or not, the worker larva and the drone larva give off their different pheromones. The mites are more driven to go to drone cells because they get 3 extra days to reproduce. In a worker cell, the chance for the mice to reproduce, they usually get 1.3 offsprings in a worker cell. In a drone cell, around 2.6 is the average reproduction rate in a drone cell. And so with that, when there are drone present, the actual mites are drawn to reproduce in drone cells. And I'm going to get back to that in just a little bit. So once the cells are uncapped, the bee emerges, it frees up the original founder's mite, which she can go through about 5 or 6 reproduction cycles, and her daughters, which are now fully mature sexually and ready to reproduce. So first thing they do is they go back, and their first ride is right here, a nurse bee. Their first opportunity, nurse bee. So with the Varroa destructor comes a lot of other stuff besides feeding on the bees and dragging them down. There are a lot of diseases that come with this. One of them that you'll really see is deformed wing virus. You can look at this bee, its wings are shriveled up, they're missing, but there is a lot of diseases that go with it. As the bees are being fed on, these diseases are being transferred between the mites to the other bees. So this is something you have to deal with. So now we have to figure out a way and a solution to figure out what's going on with the Varroa mites in our bee population. So there are two sampling methods when you're using this process. The first one is the powder sugar or the sugar roll, and the other one is the alcohol wash method. So these are the two methods that you can use. Technically, the alcohol wash method is actually more accurate than the powdered sugar shake roll method, but I'll kind of go back to that, and depending on your style of beekeeping, one will probably work better for you than the other. So the collection method. So you're going to collect approximately 300 bees from the brood nest. That's where the nurse bees are, and that's the first target of opportunity for the mites. So this is where you're going to look for Varroa mites, and you're going to do your sampling. And I put up in red letters there that, again, this is the brood chamber, and mom's in there. So you need to avoid the queen when doing any of these samplings. This is kind of paramount for you to be able to identify your queen, know she's not there, and be able to get your sample. So you're going to use 300 bees, which is equivalent of about a half a cup of lightly packed bees. Every time I read lightly packed, I keep thinking of tightly packed brown sugar on some of these. But lightly packed bees and a half a cup of is what your sample is, and that's going to be approximately 300 bees. And I'm going to actually go over this. I'm going to actually show you a sampling method here in just a second. So the first one is the powdered sugar shake method. Now this one, the bees will not die in the process if you do it correctly. So you're going to get your 300 bee sample. And I use a mason jar. Unfortunately, this one's a narrow mouth. It'd probably be a lot easier if you use a wide mouth, but I steal stuff from my wife's kitchen all the time. So they got this fine funnel here that you can put pasta sauce and stuff in the jar. Well, it helps get the bees in the jar too. So this is what I use in that aspect. But I have tons of mason jars around. This is my sampling. I get my 300 bees. I place it in there, and this is 2 regular mason jar rings with a piece of number 8 wire in there. It's hot glued together with a little bit of electrical tape on there. And so my bees are in here. So I've got my 300 sample in here. And I'm going to put a tablespoon of powdered sugar in there. And I'm going to roll this. So I'm going to roll it, give it a little shake, a little roll. I'm not trying to make margaritas here. I'm just rolling it. And then you're going to let it set in the shade. Keep it out of the sun, because usually when you're doing this, it's going to be a little warm out. You don't want to have a bunch of glazed bees look like they came from Krispy Kreme hot now kind of bees. So you want to make sure that you set it off in the shade, let it set, and then you're going to roll it, add another tablespoon of powdered sugar, and you're going to roll it around. Then you're going to take the jar, and you can use a white plate, clear glass pie pan. I've stolen my daughter's Frisbees before. They had a nice green Frisbee. And you just shake the sample into that so you can look in there. And then you're going to take a spray bottle, and you'll spritz your powdered sugar. That'll melt away, and then you'll be able to see the actual mites that are left behind. And then you'll do your mite count. And you're going to calculate per 100. All right, let's play.
Does that kill the mites, or are they still alive? Can they crawl away?
The mites are still there.
Okay.
The mites are still alive. This just dislodges them.
Okay.
So the mites are alive, and the bees are alive.
Mm-hmm.
So once you've done that and you've got your mite count, and you can return the bees back to the colony. So all the bees go back, and you have these ghost bees, which they'll remember you did that to them in the future. I swear to God. So you put all your 300 bees back, and everybody's good, and everybody's like, hey, look, everybody's coming back with some powdered sugar snack, and they clean each other up, and it's all good. So that's the powdered sugar method. The mites are there in there, but you got them spritzed in water. They're still alive in that, but again, you're gonna get rid of that. But you're just doing a count.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how quickly you have to get rid of them before they like scuttle away and they're
They're gonna be stuck in sugar water, so they're not going to move away. But they actually, if you've seen them on the bottom of a sticky board, they actually move fairly fast, and they can cling to a bee really, really quick. It's kind of amazing how fast the varroa mites are. But in this instant, it's going to be in a pie pan, a plate with some sugar water, and you just do a count looking for your little copper-headed pin specks in there to do your count for 100 bees. All right. So let's do this. So when I do this, this is my kit that I use to do sampling with. This right here, and you don't need it. This is a meat lug from Bass Pro. Comes with a lid. I throw all my stuff in there, and I carry it around, and this is what I do my sampling with. Meat lug. So what I do is I'm going to go into my colony, and I'm going to go into the brood chamber, and I'm going to pull out the frame of bees. And these are fairly docile bees. They're not really running on the frame. These are awesome bees. So they're not in my face. They don't really do a good job of producing honey, but these are awesome bees. So this came out of the brood chamber. And so what am I going to look for when I look at this frame?
Queen.
Queen. Going to make sure the queen's not in there. So what I'm going to do is take my frame, go over to my container, and I'm going to shake the bees into the container. And I'm going to put this back. And I'm going to wait a few seconds. Some of the bees are going to fly off. That's fine, because those are usually the field bees. Those are the ones that are just kind of crawling through. So then I'm going to take my half a cup and my jar and my funnel, and I'm going to get my half a cup of bees and put them in the jar. And then I'm going to, I have my sample. Oh, we're good. So now I've got my bees, my half a cup, and I'm going to use some isopropyl alcohol. And I'm going to add just enough to cover the bees. So again, this is paramount that your queen's not in here. So I'm going to swirl this around for about 2 minutes. Everybody in here is dead. Everybody in here is dead. So the first method is not as accurate, but you're not killing everybody. This method here, everybody's dead. So if you put the queen in there, she's gone. So again, accuracy. Now, kind of the theory behind it is depending on where you're at in beekeeping. You don't want to kill any bees, sugar shake. This is more accurate. If you don't have 300 bees in your colony to kill, then you're in trouble already, because 300 is not that many. So you're going to swirl this around, and you can set it down. Ooh, I missed that slide. It was up there. All right, so this is where we're at. So with this, I'm going to take and put my it's easier when you're out there in the future. All right, so then I'm going to take this and I'm going to drain the alcohol off the bees. I put it in another jar, and then these bees are dead. And then I can take and do my sample. Go ahead and look in there and see if you see any varroa mites. See if my bees had varroa mites.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's a powdered sugar method.
Yes.
You're sampling just to see if you have mites, not to eradicate.
First of all, we need to see if we have a problem.
Okay,
So you're going to see what your mite level is in there.
okay.
This is basically for monitoring what these slides were.
You see any mites in there?
Methods.
Yeah, is that accurate size of how big they are?
Is that an accurate size? I would guarantee that's 100% accurate what size they are, because that is a varroa mite.
Mm-hmm.
That is
actual varroa mite.
that is an actual varroa mite in there. That's
They're small.
a varroa mite. I'm giving you an actual example of what it looks like. I want you to see what a varroa mite looks like.
Is it easier to see them in this test versus the powdered sugar?
It depends. Some people use instead of using isopropyl alcohol, they can use windshield washer fluid. Causes the bees to float, so you don't have to pour them out, and you can look from the bottom. Again, you can always pour this liquid into a background that's white, but doing your samples the same consistently is paramount. Same shake time, same method, and repeat it so that your results are basically the same. I just wanted everybody to see what a varroa mite looks like, so that's actually, there are real varroa mites in there. Again, it's something that a lot of times you don't get to see until way late in the game before everything's out of control. So interpreting the results. I've kind of simplified the math because it was per 100. So in this case, this is a picture with 6 varroa mites in it. So we started out with 300 bees, which is a half a cup, and we had 6 varroa mites. So you take 6 and divide it by your 300 sample, which is 0.02, or a 2% mite load. So that is your percent mites in your colony. So with that, depending on the time of year, that can be a okay mite count, or it can be a bad mite count. So as we start this portion of the season, the bees are just starting to build up. They just came out of a dormant phase. 2% right now would be bad because they just came out of a dormant season. So the bees build up, and then the varroa mites start to build up after that. So as the bees start to build up, the varroas start to follow that progression. As the population increases, the mites are going to increase. And again, there's a chart right here. I'm going to give you a link to all this information I'm putting out so that you can download a PDF copy, and it will be right there for you. So I sample beginning of the year in June, right around August, and around October to make sure that to go over mite population. Now June is going to be is kind of paramount. That's where I do a lot of my maintenance and later on philosophy on that. So let's talk about varroa mites and how to control them. This is the control side. So you learned how to sample to figure out where you're at. So going back to the samurai, there are many ways to the top of the mountain. So you can follow different paths. So I'm going to give you a bunch of things that you can do to help mitigate the mites in your colony, because this is imperative that you do this. If not, they won't make it into spring. If you do zero mite management, I'm pretty sure your population is going to go into the dumper and you're not going to make it. So we're going to talk about integrated pest management. And we're going to start at the bottom, which is culture. Then we're going to go to mechanical and chemical. And there's 2 levels of chemical prevention, soft and hard. So we go from prevention to intervention. And as we go up this pyramid, the toxicity increases on your treatments. So cultural controls. The number 1 on the cultural controls is apiary location. For me, I have 2 locations. I have one in Chesapeake, in town, and I have an apiary location out in the country, in the middle of nowhere, out in Walters, off of 258. And the bees out in the country have less varroa mites than the ones in Chesapeake. So the little thought process in that is my neighbor who lives a block away does zero mite control. He lets bees do what bees do. So my bees end up getting mites from his colony, so I have to fight his lack of mite control and intervention. Out in the country, they have less of those bees to run into, so they actually have lower mite counts, truthfully. Next on the list is genetic stock. So there are queens that are genetically produced to help reduce varroa mite populations. So there's the VSH bees, which are varroa sensitive hygienic, and they basically, the workers can sense that there are pupa with varroa mites on them. They decap them and pull them out and remove those pupa. Again, Minnesota hygienic. Ankle biters, they actually, if they see fine mites, they actually start to bite the legs off the mites. And then Russians. Russians have a little bit more propensity to be resistant to varroa mites because the Russian bees share a little bit of the area with the Asian bees, so they kind of have a little bit of that built-in resistance from them genetically. So these are basically culture controls for varroa mite intervention. The next thing is physical or mechanical controls. Screen bottom boards. All my hives have screen bottom boards, and then if I want to close off the bottom boards, I use I don't even use it as a sticky board or IPM board on the bottom. I just place it in there to reduce the draft and stuff. But as the bees are moving through the colony, they're rubbing up against each other. They're actually knocking the varroa mites off the phoretic ones that are on the outside of the bees. And they'll drop through the screen bottom board, and they'll drop out of the colony. This probably only equivalates to about 3% of the mite population that'll drop through. But hey, if I get 3% for free by using a screen bottom board, I'm good with that. Next, and this is really important here, and this is what I truthfully, and in my opinion, is one of the best ways to naturally counter the mite population, and is drone trapping. And this is usually done when the nectar flow is on, when the bees are reproducing, and they're making drones. So this is a green actual frame. This is by Perco. Yeah, Pergo.
Yeah.
And this actually is the cell size for drones. Drone cells are larger than worker cells, so you try to tell the bees what you want to do. They'll do it most of the time. Sometimes they'll not do it. But anyways, you can put a drone frame in, and I usually put this in the brood chamber between the brood and the honey and pollen frames on the edge, because the bees want to put the drones out on the edge of the colony. That's where they normally put the drones. So when I do drone trapping, I do it basically, I take a regular frame and I take a piece of that green and I mark drone on there so that I know it's in there, and then the bees will draw this out in drone. And then when I go do my inspections, I take this frame out and I just take a box knife and cut and drop this into a pan. I leave a few drones up there and I put it back in the colony. Again, varroa mites have a tendency to go into drone brood. That's their preferred target of opportunity. So we are using their reproduction method against them by doing drone calling. So most of during the nectar flow, when things are good, when drones are present, this is where most of the drones will be. Now the key to this is you need to remove this drone frame after this is capped. If you leave it in there and forget about it, this becomes a drone bomb. This is nothing but, mite bomb. This is nothing but mites emerging. So you need to remove this before the drones start to come out of the capping. I cut it out, throw it in a pan, and then fortunately I have chickens. And the chickens love drones. So I take it, set the larvae out there, they'll start pulling out all the larvae, and then I throw the wax into the wax melter, and that is one method I do. So the next thing on the list, and again, is brood interruption. So And this usually occurs right around the June time frame is brood interruption. And basically what I do is lock down the queen. I lock down the queen for about a week. I put her into a situation where she can't lay. So basically it shuts down the ability for a week for the varroa mites to find a home. And my favorite tool is I use a queen introduction frame. You can use a queen cage like they have here, basically 8 wire, you place it over the top. But I use a queen introduction frame, and this is where I put my queen for about a 7-day period. And again, I mark the top of my frames. I'm kind of one of those people that marks everything. But there's a little door in here. You can take queen and put her in there and lock her down. And again, in the June time period, this is a good time if your colonies are robust and building up, is you can do a split. A split is another perfect opportunity to increase more bees and basically break the brood cycle. And if you're got the queen locked down, this is another opportunity for requeening. And you can kind of do a double bonus on this one is when you requeen, is you can requeen with a known a VHS queen that's sensitive, Russian queen, ankle biter, and you can replace the queen with known genetics that you have in your colony. All right, the last thing on the physical controls is thermal treatment. So basically this is a treatment where you heat your hive to about 109 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 3 hours. And this usually works best in the summertime when you don't have to drive the heat and this heater right here too hard. The only thing about this is kind of tricky because that threshold is very finite on what kills the mites and what hurts the bees. Also with that is the queen. The queen is subject to heat. The genetic material from the males that she stores in her body is susceptible to temperature. So the genetic material from the males, if exposed to quite a bit of heat, will deteriorate. So be careful with this method, but it is effective. Yes, ma'am.
Could you remove your queen to a quiet box while you're doing this process and then put her back afterwards with just one frame of bees?
Truthfully, I would be careful with that because we're talking 3 hours. Within an hour, they're going to know that the queen's gone. And they're going to... You pull her out for 3 hours and they're already saying mom's gone, and they may start going into emergency supersedure mode. But with that, we're working on another. We're reverse engineering a hive heater right now. So, but I'll get back to that.
Okay.
But this, I'm kind of a geeky person on that. We're actually. I'll go off
We're
track.
working on projects.
Yeah, well, this one here is the heat blows down through the middle of the colony and the air returns up the outside of the frames. So the heat's going to go down through the brood chamber. The return air, which is going to be cooler, is going to go up the outside of the frames. And basically, the queen and the other bees can move to the outside of the heat column to get out of that heat, which is kind of the theory behind that. But again, we're actually working with a PhD up in Maryland. It's Andy and Nate and myself on reverse engineering this. But sorry about that, guys. I'm just...
He's excited about it.
So what does the thermal treatment do?
The thermal treatment is right at the threshold where it will kill and sterilize the varroa mites.
Okay,
Right around 109 degrees Fahrenheit for about 3 hours.
but it doesn't hurt the bees.
It stresses the bees pretty hard.
Okay.
But the bees are, to me, this method is more effective once you get down deep into summer, into August, when there's like 93, 95 degree days where the bees have already acclimated to some of this heat, and you can drive them a little bit more past that. But 109, you'll find the bees coming out of the hive and bearding and getting out of the hive because it's hot in there, and they're going to leave the kids behind in there, which 85% of the varroa mites are under the capping anyways. So that's really where you want to be with the heat, is not the bees themselves, but the brood. So this is something probably I wouldn't recommend for new beekeeper first year. This is something later on in the phase of life where you start to build toys up and start to kind of go off and have fun. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about on varroa mite control is chemical controls. So we're going to talk about these bugicides. They're meant to kill the varroa mite. So I'm going to start out with a disclaimer. Always check the label before you use any chemicals and understand the instructions, and then reread that instruction again to make sure you read the instructions. And if you use these for years, 2-3 years, still go back and read the instructions to make sure you understand the instructions. And a lot of these chemicals are nasty, and they have specific protective equipment that you need to wear when you're using them. I'm going to kind of cover these in overall general, but again, when you get these chemicals, they will come with instruction sheets, MSD labels, and all the fun stuff that goes along with that. So again, safety. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the list, and again, as I start to work up, these chemicals are going to become more toxic. So we're going to start with the essential oils. Life Bar. This is a actual rectangular stick. You break it into 4 sections, and you place it in the 4 corners of the brood chamber in your hive. So the 4 pieces are in the corner. You close off the bottom board. The first tablet you're going to put in there for 7 to 10 days. The third tablet is going to be 7 to 10 days. And then the maximum of 2 applications. And this cannot be used when honey supers are on the hive. And the temperature range is around 64 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and these are kind of recommended in the spring and the fall. The last on the essential oils is the Apiguard or Thymol. This is spring, fall, temperature 60 to 105. And this is basically a little container. You peel it open and you place it on top of the brood chamber. And again, this depending on the time of year, the temperature, you may have to use a lower dosage. Also with this, you'll probably have to use some kind of shim because this container is probably about 3/4 of an inch tall, so you won't be able to fit it in between the boxes in your brood chamber. So you may have to use a shim in there. And with this, you have to keep an eye on it because at that point you just broke bee space by throwing a shim in there. And they may put bridge comb in there. They may do some stuff you don't want them to do, but you're treating for varroa mites. And this one's not used with honey supers on. Next on the list, moving up in toxicity, is acids. First on the list is oxalic acid. So there's 2 treatment methods with the oxalic acid. One is to dribble it in. You basically mix the oxalic acid, and there'll be, and later on in the literature, it'll talk about the amount of oxalic acid to 1-to-1 sugar water or 2-to-1 sugar water. You're going to mix it with sugar water and dribble it on the bees, and the oxalic acid is going to be on the bees. Now you have to be careful with this. This is spring and fall, and you don't want to put it on the bees when it's cold out because you can basically throw the bees into hypothermia. So you don't want to put this on the bees when they're cold. And the other method is vaporization. Basically, you take and heat the oxalic acid up to around 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which will basically go what's called sublimination. Basically, you're going to take a powdered oxalic acid, it's going to heat up, it's going to go from a solid to a gas. Completely misses the liquid state, so it's called sublimination. And it's going to vaporize through the hive, and this will get on the bees, and it will kill the varroa mites. And again, this treatment and the other treatments that I was talking about, the essential oils, oxalic acid is only working on the phoretic mites, the 15% of the bees that are, or 15% of the mites that are on the outside. And again, currently, I'm going to say currently, as of this lecture, you're not supposed to use oxalic acid on honey supers, but this is about ready to change next month. The FDA is saying that it's okay to use oxalic acid in your beehives with honey supers on. So, I use oxalic acid for my mite treatments, and I will not use this while I have honey supers on. And I'm going to go back to that is drone trapping is probably more effective when you have honey supers on, and a more natural method for mite treatments, in my opinion. And that's the way I would do mite treatments when the honey supers are on. is this honey is meant for humans consumption, and why introduce something else in there. All right, next on the acids is formic acid. Mighty Weight Quick Strips. Spring, summer, fall, when temperatures are between 50 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. You see something here on 85, it says summer. How many summer days do we have? And this needs to be 3 consistent days of 85 degrees Fahrenheit in this area. Not going to happen too often. So this is something you need to be careful with. You're going to place 2 strips in the brood chamber, kind of kitty corner from it. You're going to close off the bottom screen, and you're going to not disturb the hive. And this is allow the 1 month between applications, and you should be careful with this. And this can be used during the honey flow. Formic acid is really, really rough on the bees, especially Mighty Weight Quick Strips. I've used it before. I felt sorry for my bees when I used this. They were pretty miserable in the process, but it does work. It kills the mites under the cappings. I actually sat down, did this. I had a hive that was really, really in bad shape. And again, we'll go back to the I'm a nerd. I actually pulled the bottom board out and I counted the mites. My first drop was 1,556 mites off the entire colony. This was 5 boxes of bees. It was a big colony, but it was 1,500 mites dropped off the mites. And that doesn't include the other portion that was under the capping, which dropped out later. But this is very effective, but it killed my queen. So I got requeening out of the process. So I killed all the mites. I got a brood break and a new queen. Next on the list is Formic Pro. Almost identical to Mighty Weight Quick Strips, but this one is a little less aggressive. This is same basically specs on it, but you leave it on for 14 days. So this is longer period of time instead of the 7. And so basically this is a slower release. Same thing. It kills the mites under the capping. Can be used during the honey flow. And that is Formic Pro.
Better of the two, because Formic Pro has a 2-year shelf life, and Mighty Weight Quick Strips only has a 1-year shelf life.
And it's less messy. I'm
Yes.
just gonna say.
Yes,
Yeah.
easier to handle.
Yeah. Formic Pro is a little less aggressive. It's a slower release.
It's on the shelf right back there.
Yeah. It's
So is the oxalic acid.
I'm there. But again, there's many approaches here, and mixing up your methods and stuff is the key. Next on the list is Hop Guard. It's a hop beta acid. Again, this is spring, summer, fall. Temperatures greater than 50 degrees. Basically, 2 strips are located in the brood chamber. You're going to unfold the strips. You're going to make sure that they're half is over each side, and you can do this treatment about 3 times a year. This can be done with the honey supers on, and this is another method. All right, let's go to the top of the list of chemicals. Synthetic chemicals. There are 3 synthetic chemicals that you can use. And I'm going to be kind of a little... So Apistan, it's a fluvalent. Remember when I talked about mites get resistant to treatments? A lot of the commercial beekeepers use Apistan and or fluvalent to treat their hives. For the most part, mites are resistant to Apistan. Can't be used with the honey super on. There's the information on it. Skipping by. Checkmite or Coumaphos. Both of these, fluvalent and Coumaphos, build up in the wax. So these chemicals build up in the wax and end up in the wax. Coumaphos is also, mites are resistant to Coumaphos and can be used with it honey supers on. So I'm skipping by that. Apivar. This is on the last list, and that's Amitraz. Amitraz is highly effective, and again, this is up at the top of the list. You're going to put 2 strips in the brood chamber, and you're going to leave them in there for 42 days. Remove the strips 2 weeks prior to a honey flow. Again, these can't be used during a nectar flow when you have honey supers on. So that is Apivar. I've kind of was bad to Coumaphos and the other one because they are ineffective. I'm just going to come out straightforward and tell you that. And again, this is my opinion. I'm not wrong.
You're right.
All right, so the last thing, all this stuff that I covered all these chemicals for varroa mites can be found at the honeybeehealthcoalition.org. There is a printout. This goes into depth of all this information I covered. It talks about when to use it, temperatures, chemicals. It talks about protective gear. This is a awesome resource for information. So please jot this down. And this is I'm telling you, this, you can print it out, but this is awesome information for varroa mite treatments.
And they have great videos on everything.
Yes. So this is a great, great resource.
Can I ask a couple questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you said don't do it when the honey is flowing. Why?
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 Because a lot of these chemicals, again, the bees are creating honey. You're going to take the excess honey from the hives in the future. First year, you shouldn't even think about honey. That shouldn't even be in your vocabulary.
Right.
Your goal as a first year beekeeper is to grow these bees and make them through the winter.
Okay.
And then in the springtime, you'll become a bamboo farmer because it'll try to keep them in the box, keep them from swarming and making honey. It'll become a whole different game second year. First year is just trying to grow them up, make them a big box of bees, and everybody's happy.
Okay.
And again, I went over varroa mite control because that's going to be on the backside of your first year of beekeeping. You need to know some varroa mite controls and treatments and stuff that you can do.
Okay.
But the honey is a food product and something that I'm going to consume, other people are going to consume, so you want the purest, untainted product that you can. So avoid using those chemicals on that in that process.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. One other question. So I read that, because you mentioned that you can do certain controls during certain times of the year.
Yes.
And I had read that you can put menthol in year round, and you should keep it in there.
And that is a method. There's multiple methods. I'm giving the ones that are documented that are effective.
Right. Well, you mentioned the menthol is an essential
That's the thymol.
oil.
The thymol
Right.
is it does have menthol and camphor, and but that is a treatment that is a spot treatment.
Okay.
So
It's
most of these are spot treatments.
It's also scientifically, like, they figured out the exact amounts that you need. If you buy just essential oils, they've shown that, although it kind of helps with bee health because they get essential oils from plants, the amount that you're providing is not enough to be effective.
Okay.
So the treatments you buy they've figured out the math, they've figured out how to release it, all of this other stuff, so that it's effective as a treatment. Just putting essential oils in your hive, I mean, it's not going to necessarily hurt your bees, except maybe with their pheromones, but you're not going to have the concentrations
Okay.
needed to actually be an effective treatment method against pests, except maybe hive beetles.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that actually the one that had thymol on it does actually deter hive beetles also,
Mm-hmm.
and it also helps with deterring actual tracheal mites too, the ones with the camphor. And any other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir.
The oxalic acid.
Yes.
Oxalic acid. Isn't that kind of like a new process that just came out not too long ago?
It's been used for a while. It was actually started out in Europe, and it's been used over there for years in Europe, and then it was brought to the U.S. and the FDA was getting, and again, a lot of these treatments that we're using, all the ones I showed up there are approved by the FDA, approved to use in the hive, and so this is a method. About 10 years ago, oxalic acid was being used in Europe, but was not approved for the U.S. So the FDA, in order to be used correctly and legally, it needs to be approved by the FDA to use in your hives. So oxalic acid just got into the process probably about 4 or 5 years ago.
You know it's approved if the label is an EPA registered label.
Yes, and all those in this honeybee coalition, on all those chemicals I just went over, it does have the EPA registered number that goes with all that the different chemicals that I talked about. This actual honeybee coalition covers the EPA authority to use that, and that it's legal to do. But I treat with oxalic acid. That is one of my methods. I do drone trapping, I do brood interruption, I do splits. On occasion, if things are I haven't done my due diligence, and I'll break into some formic acid to really kind of put that in perspective. But again, all the other stuff that I covered, it's mix up your bag of tricks. That way you don't end up in the fluvalent and the coumaphos where they become ineffective because they've been overused. So again, changing your tools up.
The only reason I'm more interested in oxalic acid is I did a little bit of research on it, and if it's done, it takes only about, like, I want to say maybe 2 minutes to do the treatment over a period of 3 weeks.
Yes, and that's exactly the way I do it. So, and I'll backtrack on oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is technically only effective on the phoretic mites on the outside of the bees, and usually it's prescribed to be done during the dormant period of time when there are not as many capped cells, when the queen is not laying, and it basically does that. And the method you're talking about, which actually I do, is every 5 to 7 days in 3-week period, I treat the bees with a vaporization of oxalic acid. I can treat all 6 of my hives in about 10 minutes. So I can treat all 6 hives. I have a hole in the back of the bottom board. I vaporize them, and I'm out. And it's done. And that is a method that I use. And yes, you're correct. You can use it every 3 weeks.
Well, that's the brood cycle in there. That's why I said that for 3 weeks.
Well, you're kind of off skewing the brood cycle. As the brood emerges, you're going to hit the
right.
Can we stress the need for a respirator
Yes,
on that,
that was the other
because
thing.
Well,
it's
and
really
again-
important.
Yes, and I'm going back to the kind of funny. You talk about respirators. I actually have. You need a respirator that's for organic acids that has the correct filters on it. I use a full face shield. I have like $150 actual mask that I wear. It's a full shield, and prices of masks have went up with COVID-19, but using the proper respirator, gloves, and being properly protected when you do it. But yes, that is a method with that. Any other questions? All right, let's continue on. Small hive beetles. This is something that you'll run into as a beekeeper, is small hive beetles. This is another fine pest that came from Africa. This is basically a sap beetle. They can actually fly as fast as bees. They can fly with swarms. When the swarm leaves, a couple hive beetles will jump on board and start to fly away with the swarm. So you can fly very well. They enter through the hive. They can sense the smell of honey and pollen. They'll enter the colony. But the bees actually keep them confined, for the most part, in small cracks and crevices. These hive beetles are considered a secondary or opportunity pest, and they only cause damage when the colony becomes stressed or weakened. So when you're doing control with that, you can deter your hives or deter the small hive beetles by putting your hives in direct sunlight. They don't like heated, hot hives. If they're in the shade, they're cooler, and the hive beetles have a tendency to thrive more. So with that, there's a couple of things that you can do. A beetle blaster or a beetle gel. You can mix up a solution, basically some water, some apple cider vinegar, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and half a ripe banana skin. Grind that up, put it into a jar, let it kind of ferment, kind of get odoriferous for about 2 days. Place it in the bottom of the bee gel or the beetle blaster, and you can put these in between the frames, and the beetles will be drawn in there. They go into the traps, they can't get out, and they die. And then you can take these traps out, clean them out, reload them, and put them back in when you're doing your hive inspections. So again,
Diatomaceous earth works really well and doesn't smell.
what's that?
Diatomaceous earth.
Oh yes,
works
diatomaceous
really well.
earth works good too.
And it
But
doesn't smell.
that doesn't. You need something to attract them in there in that little bait area. But the diatomaceous earth is. Some people put oil in the bottom, mineral oil. Diatomaceous earth, the beetles will crawl in, and the diatomaceous earth cuts them up. But that is one of the 2 methods to stop the hive beetles. Again, these are secondary pests. They usually show up or overwhelm the hive when the hive is low in population, it's stressed, it's already weakened. And this is what happens when you have a small hive beetle infestation. They basically go into cells, they eat the honey, eat the pollen, and they defecate in there. And basically the bees will not clean these up. They do not like these frames. They are horrible. And if it gets really bad, the bees will abscond. They will leave. They will go. Next on the list of an opportunist is the wax moth. Greater and lesser wax moths. They lay their eggs, they burrow through the comb, and they're basically eating the debris in the cells. Every time a bee pupates, it leaves a cocoon behind. And basically the wax moths eat through the wax, eat the cocoons, and they eat the remaining portion in there. And they leave webbing behind. So honeybees are usually very good at protecting their colonies from wax moths and wax moth larvae. One of my things that it kind of bugs me when I hear is people say, my honeybees died from wax moths. They did not. They did not, I'm going to say they did not die from wax moths. They died from poor beekeeping practices. So, I truly believe in a purest fact that wax moths have their purpose in life, truthfully. Out in nature, bees usually live in hollows of trees. After a while, they leave that colony, they move, they swarm, they leave. Wax moths come in there, they eat all the wax, they clean it up, and it's a new home, fresh and ready for a new set of bees to move into. Wax moths do have a purpose in life, to take care of death and destruction. So, wax moth, this is what wax moth damage. And again, these show up, a lot of times it's your queen, you have a queen that is dead, failing, missing queen. This is where it usually finds there's not enough bees in the colony to protect them from the wax moths. So with that, doing your hive inspections, making sure your queen is up and laying, you have good brood pattern, you have a good quality bee population, you will not have this problem. Next on the list is wasps. Usually you find this right around the September, the August-September population is when the wasps start to build up. And they kind of bum rush the door. They kind of sneak in and they go in there and try to sneak in through the entrance. They go in and they steal the stores. And they're basically stocking up for the winter because they're gonna hunker down for the winter. But the wasp population usually meets its peak right around the August-September time frame. And they usually pick on one hive. They try to overwhelm one. So they go and they start to go in there. One summer I saw one of my hives tried to get penetrated by wasps. I went out there with a rubber glove and one of those fancy Ginsu gloves that you can't cut with knives. And I sat there on the corner of the hive, and every time a wasp would land on the corner of the hive, I would pick it up and throw it in a jar of alcohol. In a 3-hour period, there was 100 wasps in that jar of the wasps trying to penetrate that hive. So wasps are more prevalent again at the end of summer as where they build up. All right, my favorite picture. Bears. This is actually a picture of one of my colonies. So, yeah, well, I'll tell you the story about that one too. They visit apiaries at night, sometimes over successive nights, and they overturn hives and they eat the brood. The brood is actually the key here. Despite what the Winnie the Pooh stories are, honey is kind of the snack on the backside. The brood is protein. That's what they're looking for, the protein. The honey is just kind of a bonus. So this is a picture of my hive. Bears are nocturnal. A buddy of mine said, hey, I live on the edge of the Dismal Swamp. That should have been warning sign number 1. He said, we don't have bears here. I haven't seen any in years. I was like, awesome. So I took this colony out there, and I got the colony, put it out there, and about 2 weeks later, it was in that condition there. It was turned over, twisted, and the bear had taken it. It looked like it put it under his arm and basically started walking through the woods and licked the frames clean. They were plastic foundation. They were licked completely clean. Nothing there. Cleaned off all the frames. They were scattered 100 yards out in the woods. I went to the woods picking up all the frames. So kind of the humor behind this is about a month prior, I got this nuke colony, and it was loaded in hive beetles. So I put it out there, and I was still fighting a hive beetle problem. The bear came and wiped out the basically cleaned everything up. What you can't see
Took care of your hive beetle problem.
is right here on this cinder block is most of the colony. And then there's some over here. So I went and collected up all those bees and put them into nuke equipment. And the first thing I did when I put them back in there, I gave them some frames of foundation. I gave them a frame of eggs and larvae from another hive because I didn't know whether mom had made through the bear fun. So I gave them a frame of eggs and larvae, and I shook another frame of nurse bees in there to give them an extra cushion. So I put them in nuke equipment, and 7 days later, queen cells. So mom didn't make it through the process. End up, they requeened, they spooled back up, and they were a successful colony. For the humor of it, I call them Ursa Minor. I usually give all my colonies fun names. Ursa Minor is little bear. So that colony cured my hive beetle problem dead on. I didn't have hive beetle problem after that. I got a new queen, and everything was good. So what to do with bears? Electric fence. But the key to the electric fence is electric fence has to be there prior to the bees. If you put the fence up after they've already had that nice snack of brood and honey and everything, they'll have a tendency to go through that because they already know that the grocery store is on the other side. So you need to put that in place prior to. Next on the list is fun and excitement is raccoons and skunks. These are also nocturnal visitors. I'm going to throw another one on there as possums. Possums are another one on the nocturnal list. So raccoons, skunks, and possums. They are nocturnal visitors. And basically what they do is they go up to the front of the hive and they start scratching on it. The bees come out to defend because they hear a scratching. And those nice skunks and raccoons and possums start to eat the bees. Start to chew them up, get all that juiciness out of the bees. And then they'll leave behind this bee cud. Kind of like chewing tobacco. They chew up the bees, get the juices out, and they spit the cud out. Another thing you'll notice is there'll be scratch marks on the front of the hives where they're scratching on the front. And also, something that you may not realize and all of a sudden get that aha moment is your bees all of a sudden become a little more defensive. You go out there to do a hive inspection, they're irritable. That's because they've been up late at night and all their sisters are getting chewed up and spit out onto the ground. So that's something, if your bees start to change their personality, you might want to look to see if there's some external influence that's going on that have changed your bees into that nice, calm, gentle bees to those irritable girls that are out attacking you. And last on the list is mice. They usually gain access to the hive in the autumn. They get to move in. It's nice and warm. The bees are starting to go up in a cluster. They're going up into the brood chamber, and they're clustering together. The population is starting to drop down, and the mice move in, and they actually build a nest down in the bottom. They'll eat some of the pollen. They'll eat some of the honey stores. They'll make a mess in there. They'll defecate in there. And one of the ways to prevent that is to reduce the hive entrance size or use a mouse guard to prevent the mice from going into the colony. And last but not least, any questions?
So the varroa mite at 109, it does not like that temperature.
The varroa mites, using the heat treatment, 109, and again, it's temperature versus time. So it's not 109, it's 109 at 3 hours. So the heat treatment method is based on temperature over time. And again, you have to be careful with that because it's a narrow threshold, because once you get to 114, the bees start to suffer. So maintaining that temperature in that threshold for that length of time and being spot on with your temperature is important with it. But it is a natural method or a physical method to do controls on varroa mites. But again, truthfully, it is a very, very dangerous method to work with because it's a very finite window that you need to be in, and there's not too much threshold to put the car in the ditch on this one. And so you need to be careful. And as you increase temperature, the virility of the genetic material in the queen from the males starts to die. And you could end up having a queen that is no longer capable of producing workers because she needs the male genetic material to make workers, to create fertilized eggs.
How about with the mice in the cold? Is there a certain, do they just die off at a certain temperature in the cold, or
The mites are right next to on the worker bees. They're on the worker bees, so they've got that nice warm body. They're in the bees cluster, and they're riding out the winter with the bees. So, and then a few of them will drop down into the cells when there's, so they're a small amount, but they're gonna make it through the winter. And
on the bees.
On the bees.
Because the brood's not really there during the winter.
So they drop off. It's gonna start to taper off. Usually, the bee population is truthfully driven off sunlight. When right around the winter solstice is about the 22nd of December. That is when the queen is going to start to kick up. In the December time frame, beginning of December to about the 22nd, that's when the queen is going to stop and just shut down for a little bit. I've ran temperature sensors in the hive, and you can tell when the queen actually stops production and there's no brood. Is the hive will be around 85 degrees Fahrenheit in the cluster or in the brood chamber. If the queen is laying, there's actually bees being produced in there. It's going to be about 93.4 degrees Fahrenheit, dead on the money. And so you can see, so the bees actually drop the temperature down to conserve energy when they are not in a reproductive cycle. But 22 December, they're about ready to spool back up, and the bees have to be ahead of the nectar flow. They can't say, hey, which is going to start here in just a few weeks. So the bees, a worker bee, 42 days before she's ready to become a field day and go out and gather all that nectar goodness to turn into honey. So the bees have to be 42 days ahead of what's going on out here.
Is there like a chart or a schedule? Because you've mentioned, a lot of timing issues, and I just wondering if it's like compiled somewhere.
So there is a calendar for that.
Okay.
There's a calendar, and the honeybee org has stuff in there. That coalition handout that I pointed you to has all that information. You can go to it. It's a perfect resource, and then you can mix that in with your beekeeping techniques and pick these methods that I went over varroa control, and again, mix them up. Don't use the same thing every time in a row, and pick what works for you in your bee yard. I know some people are more kind of gravitates towards the natural, not using chemicals, and there are some awesome techniques in there that are do that: brood interruption, drone trapping, and then as you move up the scale, you may have to change your philosophy and use some formic acid or use some oxalic acid, because truthfully you want to take care of your bees and make sure that just like if you had a dog, if a dog had ticks and fleas on it, you can only pick a few of them off before it's time to go to a flea collar or medicine. Any other questions?
Last week we talked about, wasn't it wax paper and mineral oil to control?
Bob was here.
So let me go back with that. The methods that I mentioned are in the and that method is talked about in the Honeybee Health Organization handout. That method does not have a proven efficacy of treatment. Also, another one, which I'm going to probably get yelled at here, is shaking powdered sugar onto your bees is not shown to have a overall high effect of varroa mites. Makes a lot of tasty sugar in the hive, but again, in the Honeybee Coalition, that is one of the methods that says that people use, and it is not known to be highly effective, along with mineral oil.
Because the mineral oil manufacturers aren't advertising, I guess.
They haven't paid the FDA off, I guess, is probably
Right,
what
that's what I'm
it
saying.
is. But again, the methods I mentioned are in that handout that I pointed you to. It tells you when to use them, safety equipment, gloves, and again, I really wanted to go in and go in deep on varroa mite control because this is something as you get into late spring, summer, and fall, you need to kind of come up with a plan of attack to control the varroa mites because you will have them in your hive. Guaranteed, 100%. No questions. And you've seen them, everybody got to see a varroa mite or two. And they're usually on the nurse bees, they're tucked up under the thorax. So a lot of times you won't be able to see them. If you're doing a hive inspection and they're going across the frames, they're not going to be high up on the back. Most of their target area is right here on the lower abdomen, and you won't be able to see them. So I'm just saying you will have varroa mites. How many varroa mites depends on your due diligence as a beekeeper and not being a bee haver.
I have another question.
Yes, sir.
When you first started out, you were talking about the foul brood, American and European, and it seems like if you have American foul brood, it's over.
Yes.
There's really not any.
And that one is basically burn the equipment, get rid of it, and it's bad. But again, I think there were 0 cases of American foul brood in Virginia last year. 0. One.
We had a case in Holland about 5 years ago, but that's the only one I've ever heard of.
Right.
It's very unusual.
So I am going to say something about American foul brood. One, it's a reportable disease, so you should call Keith, our state apiarist, or your local state apiarist, because it is a reportable disease, and you want to make sure, because what's going to happen is when they come in and mitigate that foul brood, they have to check every apiary within 5 miles of your apiary for American foul brood. And they circle out, if one of those apiaries has American foul brood, they go out another 5 miles, and then another 5 miles. And the reason why is because they have to destroy your equipment. Because American foul brood is highly contagious, and it can cause a very serious problem if you have a lot of concentrated beekeepers in an area, which we do in the Tidewater area. We have a lot of beekeepers. So it's really important that if you suspect American foul brood, you report it to the state apiarist, because it's not just you, but it's your neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors' neighbors. So.
And you want to call the inspector or one of the master beekeepers to look at it, because there are smells in the hive that an inexperienced beekeeper may think, oh, it's American foul brood, when it may be goldenrod in the fall. So you want to make sure that you call and have it inspected and treated properly.
Oh, and one other thing that, as you brought, comb management is American foul brood is technically in the environment that we live in. But as the spores build up, then the chances of it spreading increase. So all these pests and diseases that I talked about, the different things, the chemicals using is comb management. That you should, by minimum, is rotate your comb out every 5 years. I run 3. And so removing and putting fresh comb in there, because as these bees go out, they're bringing back pesticides, they're bringing herbicides, and that's building up in the comb, and that's their home. So kind of to give you insight on that is, I run medium frames, and my colonies are usually 4 boxes at this time of year. I'm going into 4. I overwinter in 3. So when I go into winter, I go from 4 boxes to 3. That's 8 frames that come out of the hive and they go into the wax melter. That is 25% of the comb is gone. When spring comes up, I put new foundation in there, and they go to 4 boxes. I ladder basically it's swarm prevention, because I open up the brood chamber, they build new comb, fresh wax, and so I'm basically refreshing the wax. I mark on all my frames what year that frame was brand new, and I do that as part of my disease pest management, chemical, getting it out of the hive. So again, there's other management that sometimes I don't think to bring up. I just do automatically, and it's something that I do. But again, comb management, making sure that you don't have a place for the disease chemicals and stuff to build up in is important too. Any other questions? All right.
Thank